So as Jess said, I'm a first into second year PhD student at John Griffin's lab. My background is basically on community ecology. So I look into biodiversity patterns and how these changes in biodiversity affect the movement of materials and energy in ecosystems, that is the functioning of ecosystems. For this PhD chapter, what I'm looking at is at essentially two different environmental patterns that we find over space, environmental gradients and environmental heterogeneity, and how the interaction of these two affect biodiversity and its consequences on the ecosystem. So why did I look into these two patterns? Well, looking at the literature, I found that it's quite common to refer to spatial heterogeneity in a broad way, meaning either environmental gradients or environmental heterogeneity, but those mean two different things. And I'm going to explain that with an example looking at the rocky shore. For those who are less familiar with the rocky shore, here there is an example of a rocky shore intertidal gradient that we have from the land, where we have more abiotic stress, and the sea, where we have more competition. So let's say that we go to the rocky shore and we sample the higher shore. We obtain 4 readings of temperature of 1 and 4 degrees. Let's just say it's a very cold day, just to keep things simple. And then we have this spatial configuration for it. Then we go a bit lower the shore, and we find that there is actually 4 different levels this time of temperature. So in the second case, we have higher heterogeneity. So let's differentiate now between environmental gradients and environmental heterogeneity. Environmental gradients have to do with the magnitude of the environmental variable that we're looking into. So we have differences over a space to do with this environmental gradient. But with environmental gradient, we can change it by increasing the value of the variable or by increasing the overall range of values that we have in consideration. But that does not affect the heterogeneity that we find. Heterogeneity itself is just the number of differences that we have over a space. And it's surprising how much these two considerations or these two perspectives are confounded in the literature. So let's look as well at the 2 different effects that environmental gradients and heterogeneity can have on diversity. So when we have an environmental gradient, we'll see that it has an effect on species fitness. I'm sure we have seen that already in lectures, but basically each species has a fitness optima. And then as you move towards the margins, or you move towards more extreme environmental variables or levels for this species, you enter in a stress zone where fitness is compromised. However, in nature, we don't find only abiotic variables. We have also biotic factors to take into account, meaning that other species will also be distributed along these gradients and will also affect this fitness for these species. So we need to take into account diversity as well when assessing this environmental gradient. These gradients are not univariate, and this is particularly important for cases with multiple stressors that you need to take into account the interaction between these gradients, because they can be additive or they can annulate or inhibit each other. And we care about these environmental gradients because they affect the delivery of ecosystem services from which humans benefit. These ecosystem services are underpinned by ecosystem functions, which in turn depend on this species fitness that I just shown, and also depend on species diversity. I'm going to expand a bit more on these 2 aspects with environmental heterogeneity. But now let's get into environmental heterogeneity effects on diversity and functioning. I showed already this pattern before, but we need to understand quite well what's happening in here in order to understand later its effects on diversity. So to do that, we need to understand 2 main spaces, niche space and metric space. This sounds very complicated, but it's easier than it sounds, I promise. So niche space is basically the combination of 2 or more environmental variables, meaning that any point inside this space, it's a unique combination of these 2 variables. basically like any plot we would have with two different variables. A metric space is just real space, and we can just define it with spatial coordinates like longitude and latitude, for example. So in the first case here, when we have only one type of environmental variables, we see that the metric space associated with this environmental variable is quite large, but it only corresponds to one combination of environmental variables. As we move on to more heterogeneous cases, we see that the metric space gets split up, but it increases the amount of space occupied in niche space. So we find that environmental heterogeneity, in fact, increases niche space, but reduces metric space. Yeah, it's important to have this quite clear, because it later on reverberates into the effects of diversity. So let's jump straight into that. This slide is probably the most theoretical one that I have. So bear with me, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but just to make sure that I lay enough theoretical grounds for the aims and hypothesis. So we know that from previous studies that increasing niche space actually allows the species to find other combinations or other spaces from which they cannot be outcompeted. So it reduces competition. It facilitates colonization, or it enables colonization by providing different conditions. So each species can find the conditions that allow them to get established. However, it's going to be more difficult as the amount of space available is reduced to actually find this space. So there's going to be a balance here. And also population size is going to be reduced because you have less space to occupy, therefore less individuals. And that's going to affect increased demographic stochasticity. And all that affects diversity. Different studies, or there is a tradition of studies that have shown that these two effects actually allow to connect diversity with ecosystem functioning. That is, the effects that diversity have on the movement of matter and energy in ecosystems. And from there we go to multifunctioning, which is where you get all the functions in an ecosystem together. So you have a general sense of how much matter and energy is moving in this ecosystem. Everything is quite conceptual, but it's necessary to understand a bit later on the results. But there are other effects. We reduce environmental stress, as I showed you before in the environmental gradient. We are able to provide more conditions, so this stress is reduced. And this has positive effects on diversity and functioning as well. And then we have negative effects due to population size and positive effects due to species fitness. So that's it from for theory, I promise. So let's just jump onto the aims and hypotheses. So my aim, as I said, is to study the interaction between an environmental gradient and a spatial environmental heterogeneity. But how can I translate that to the rocky shore case? Basically, I look at the intertidal gradient and the micro topography of the rocky shore. The intertidal gradient, I've already shown you what it is. And the micro topography, we're just representing it with substrate roughness, which basically we describe as the adding of these grooves in a series of experimental tiles that we have deployed on the rocky shore. These tiles have three types of grooves, and the spatial configuration of these grooves is standardized across tiles. So all tiles are equal, and we have them distributed along the shore. From this, we have four hypotheses. First, that substrate roughness increases species diversity. This is a hypothesis that's been tested many times, but just to cover the basics, we're also testing it as well. Substrate roughness also drives community structure, drives ecosystem functioning, and the effects of substrate roughness are going to change along the environmental gradient. So that's also, these four hypotheses is probably the most relevant one for this case. So how did I get the data? We have the environmental gradient across the rocky shore, and then we have 7 different stations. In one transect we have 8, but in general we have 7. In each station we have a pair of tiles, rough and smooth, and we have 5 transects in total. From each style, we've taken pictures that we have analyzed on Photoshop and a point counting estimate software to get different variables that make up these different data sets that we are using for modeling and then test the hypothesis. So for the hypothesis testing using statistical models, the first hypothesis is tested using these response variables to do with diversity. The second one, we're using cover, abundance, and traffic data. And the third one is using functional group functions and multifunctioning variables, response variables. The models that I'm using are called, for univariate response variables, I'm using generalized linear models. And for matrix type response variables, I'm using joint modeling. I have some references at the bottom, and later on, I'm also going to show the list of references in case anyone is interested. And these are the predictive variables that I'm using in the model. As the gradient, I'm using short height, representing the intertidal gradient. Topography, we have these three variables. I can talk more about it later on if there are questions, just to keep it short. Heterogeneity, we have two more variables. Time. Detectability, this is a term that's usually used in occupancy models and basically accounts for the probability that any of the species within these matrices are not detected. So because obviously human detection is not perfect, so just taking that into account as well. And latent variables that account for missing predictors in the model. And for the fourth hypothesis, we're going to look at all models and specifically these two terms and how they interact as well. So far I don't have many results because we're just focusing on getting as much data as we can now and just laying out protocols and the statistical steps that we're gonna follow in modeling. But so far we have a preliminary look at the data. This x-axis basically goes from top to bottom of the shore, okay? And then we have colors rough for rough tiles, sorry, R for rough tiles and S for smooth tiles. General patterns that we can see in autumn that differences between rough and smooth tiles are maintained, but in winter these are lost except for the lowest tiles in the rocky shore. And yeah, usually mainly this is the main pattern that we can see. However, if we go to a specific taxa, for example, fucus, which is quite important in the low shore, we see that these differences are clearer. The same goes for keystone, important functional species or important species in functional groups, and as well for consumers. So as for discussion at the minute, I just have expectations of what to find. Let's focus again on the environmental gradient. The first hypothesis has been proven already several times since 1961, I think it is, yeah. And basically it shows that when we have an homogeneous environment, we only have one fitness optima that can be filled, by one species. But when we increase environmental heterogeneity, we have more fitness optima, so we have more species occupying it. This has also cascading effects on species interactions and environmental stress, because we're going to have secondary species that are also able to colonize these spaces. And while before they wouldn't be contacting each other, now they are next to each other. So that allows the possibility for species interactions. And if we look at total productivity, that means not integrating it through biomass and area, just then the gross type of increase in biomass that we would have in the whole plot, we see that in an homogeneous environment, we're just going to have productivity from one species, whereas for heterogeneous environments, we're going to have less productivity because each species occupies less space, but overall it's going to have, or we expect to find, higher productivity than separated. Then these changes, these effects of heterogeneity change a lot with community composition and heterogeneity traits. This is to do because each environmental gradient or each point of environmental gradient is going to have different stressors and different species that can colonize So therefore effects are going to be different as well. On this second part, I wanted to link these theoretical aspects to conservation. So for that, I just created, or I'm just making a bit of a thought experiment using two different shores, one with rough substrate, another one with smooth substrate. And we have all these conditions throughout each of the rocky shores. First, we're looking at the diversity. So we're going to see that diversity, or we expect to see that heterogeneity increases diversity throughout the rocky shore. In dark purple, we have the diversity corresponding to heterogeneous environment. On pink, I'd say, yeah, corresponds to the diversity in homogeneous environments. If we look at diversity patterns over the shore, I had to change this axis like 30 minutes before starting the representation. So sorry, it's inverted, but it goes from the top of the shore to the bottom of the shore. And we see that in general, we expect to have increases in diversity across the shore, which is generally expected in rocky shores. But the contribution of the local heterogeneity to beta diversity is actually gonna decrease with rocky shore, because the total amount of species that we have at the top, it's gonna be lower. So the proportional increase in diversity per species is gonna be higher. And this is indicative that actually heterogeneity is more important in situations where environmental stress is larger. So that would be quite indicative. We see some of these effects in the data, but because we cannot test it, it's just a speculation at the moment. More importantly, these local plots, they are also connected to each other. So because environmental stress is reduced, species that would usually occupy lower parts of the shore, they are able to occupy higher parts of the shore. This environmental stress is also reflected to reduce mortality, and these allow new species interactions that wouldn't occur in smooth rocky shores, so to speak, or smooth or homogeneous environments. That's the one. If we look now at multifunctioning, to look at the multifunctioning, I'm gonna need the help of these four guys. In blue, we have filtrators. This is a mussel. In light green, we have limpets or grazers. Dark green, we have producers, fucus. And then in orange, we have this whelk, which is predation. So this is a very, not very quantitatively exact type of representation. But basically what it's trying to show is that multifunctioning, we expect to have it increase across the shore, and the contributions of heterogeneity to multifunctioning are going to increase across the shore as we go down. However, if you look at the specific aspects and the proportional contribution of each of these four components to overall functioning, we see that actually filtrators may not have the highest contributions throughout following the same pattern as, for example, grazers, predators, or primary producers. And these type of effects are quite related to the specific heterogeneity trait that we are adding, because it allows specific or a certain group of species to get established. So adding other types of heterogeneity, or even combining different traits of heterogeneity and their interactions, are actually going to be quite important if we are looking for a specific functional and structural responses across gradients. So that's, if we want to target a specific service or function, then we need to go for a specific heterogeneity trait. But if what we're trying is to increase multifunctioning, increasing heterogeneity itself, it's actually already going to have an effect on multifunctioning. And this is quite important because services are not isolated from one another, functions are not isolated from one another, and one depends on the others. So increasing multifunctioning will also increase or help increase other aspects of the ecosystem that will then reverberate into specific services. And then again, this is just an argument, a speculative argument. But yeah, so these are the references I've used. And if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. Thank you very much.